Hey everyone, my name is Caleb Williams. I'm here in person with Tom Wheelwright, one of my good friends, leading tax expert, CPA, and author of Tax-Free Wealth. We are also joined virtually with Dean Baker, a renowned economist and co-founder of the Center of Economic and Policy Research. Dean, if you would like to go first, we'd love to just hear a little bit about your backstory and just your overall outlook on how you view economics and taxes as we're headed into a new era.
Well, I see that the government's role in the economy is to make sure it runs smoothly, try and maintain full employment, and it has a big role in supporting infrastructure, and that takes a variety of forms. That means obviously physical infrastructure, roads, airports, but it also means things like education, research and development. It has very big roles in there. It plays that. I mean, I'm not, that's not just my view. I mean, it does do that, and I think it should do that, and it should do a lot more of that. And in terms of taxes, we need taxes roughly commensurate with what we're spending. I don't have a problem with deficits. You can't have a deficit that's too large. Probably somewhat larger than I would like it to be today, but it doesn't panic me. But, again, you need taxes roughly in accordance with your spending. And again, my view is I want taxes mostly on those who could pay it. So it doesn't make sense to tax a minimum wage worker because they don't have the money. So we'd likely look to give it back to them in another form anyhow. So you look to tax the Elon Musks of the world. You want to tax the people that have the money. It's there's that old line about why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. Well, you tax wealthy people because that's where the money is. So that's my basic story. Also, I want to add one other thing. You want your taxes to be as simple as possible. And that is an indictment of our current tax system because you have 1,001 loopholes, many of which maybe they made sense at one time. They probably don't make sense today. You want it to be simple. That's both for the corporate and individual income tax, and there's plenty of room to complain about our current tax code along those regards.
Tom, I'll hand it over to you. Tom wrote a book on the complex nature of taxes and how you use those as a treasure map to pay as little tax as possible. Tom, what is your overall outlook on the economy, taxes, and just how you view?
Well, I'm probably a little more libertarian than you are, Dean. I think that taxes should be as low as possible, and I think the government should do as little as possible, frankly. I think there are certain things, infrastructure, defense, some social programs that the government should absolutely, it's a logical place for it to be done, okay? But anything that could be done somewhere else, I think probably should be done somewhere else. Now, the reality is, okay, I agree with you, Dean. I think taxes, the tax law is extraordinarily complex. I mean, I'm a student of the tax law. I've been a CPA for 45 years, and taxes are basically my life. And my job, actually, as I see it, is to make taxes easy to understand. I mean, that's my job, is to interpret the tax law. So I'm all for simplicity. Now, let me turn to what I think taxes actually are right now, which is not what we would hope they would be. One is, yes, they raise revenue for the government, but you talk, Dean, for example, about, the government has responsibilities with the economy. What the government has done in the last 50 years is decided, well, we're going to use taxes as a large portion of how we direct the economy. And that's just the way the taxes are. I'm not saying that's the way they should be. I would go for more laissez-faire on taxes. But politicians, being what they are, they do use, and I don't call them loopholes, I call them incentives, because they're not mistakes. Okay, they're intentional. For most, I mean, there are loopholes, don't get me wrong. Those are mistakes that are made in the law. There's no question about that. But for example, the real estate tax benefits that we have for real estate investors, it's not a loophole. That's an intentional act of Congress. It started, frankly, with Ronald Reagan. It continued with Donald Trump in his first term. We had big tax incentives for real estate. We're not the only ones. By the way, that's common throughout the world. We have big incentives for business. We have big incentives for energy. Now, the last administration wanted big incentives for renewable energy. The current administration seems to want more incentives for fossil fuel energy. But the reality is they're incentives. Okay, so for example, the special tax benefit for drilling oil and gas wells, where you get to deduct your intangible costs up front, that's not a loophole. That was intentional. That's a policy decision of the government. Now, then the question is what should be, which is a completely different question as to what is. So I just wanted to explain, here's my view of how the taxes work. Now, interesting in this term, we now have tariffs as a view, as a tax, which is not something we've seen, frankly, in any large respect for many, many, many years, really since before the Great Depression in reality. And that's a really interesting issue by itself, because I don't think anybody knows how it would actually work should we go into a major trade war like it seems like where we're headed right now.
Question for you both, and Dean, I'll send this to you first. Do you believe tax cuts contribute to more economic growth, or increasing the national debt? And what is your thoughts on national debt as it relates to, is it an issue for you, or is it not an issue for you with where we're at?
Well, in terms of tax cuts and increasing growth, I really think it depends on where the economy is, where we are in the business cycle. So if we were back in 2021, coming out of the pandemic recession, President Biden had a big recovery package. There weren't really tax cuts. I'd have to go look. There might have been some small tax cut in there. There was a tax credit, I guess, earned income tax credit, but it was basically done through spending. Now, if he had done it through tax cuts, that also would have boosted the economy, would have increased growth. Again, you could argue which route you want to go, but in that context, I think it would increase growth. When you have an economy that's close to full employment, which I would say is the case now, in other words, if we just threw $1 trillion out there, we don't have the capacity to produce another $1 trillion of goods and services. That would lead to inflation. So a tax cut now, at least a big one, again, you could always do trivial ones that don't have much impact one way or the other, that would be inflationary. Now, we could talk about getting incentives better, promoting growth. You could always look to do that, but I'd just say it's very hard to do that in a way that really has a noticeable impact on the efforts. Again, the tax cuts that we've seen, the big tax cuts, from first Reagan and then Bush 2, I should say, and then Trump, of course, in 2017. Very hard pressed to see any evidence that boosted growth. In fact, I just looked at that because we were doing this. I don't look at these numbers every single day, but I was just looking at it. I was looking at the Congressional Budget Office projections in 2017 before the tax cut. So they're doing current policy. So what are the projections for growth in 2018, 2019? Almost identical to what we actually saw. I'm ending in 2019 because, of course, we had the pandemic in 2020. You can't say much, but it's very hard. I mean, we could talk about it, and we all know the story that, taxes are disincentive. The reality is most research, at least that I've seen, finds that disincentive is very small and really not enough to have a noticeable impact on growth. Oh, you asked me about the debt, too. I'm sorry.
And what's your philosophy on the debt?
Yeah. My view is that, there is the story, we have interest burden on the debt, which is fairly large now, which we're over 3% of GDP. I'd rather we had a lower interest burden, but we can't just snap our fingers and get rid of, the interest burden, the debt we accumulated in the past. Now, if we had somewhat lower interest rates, which maybe we'll see, maybe not, that would reduce the interest burden, but we can't push the interest rate to zero. Again, Japan did. Japan has a much larger debt than we do, but because they had such a weak economy, they had their interest rates were zero, not just near zero. In fact, they were negative for much of the time. So that made the burden of their debt very trivial. But, again, I wish we had a lower interest burden. It's not a disaster because it just means money we could have otherwise devoted to, things I would consider good. Maybe others would, maybe they wouldn't. But it prevents us from doing that. Now, will we hit this story? We hear this story, oh my God, there's going to be a debt crisis. No one's going to lend us money. We're nowhere near that now. I know Elon Musk is saying that, but you go, financial markets don't agree with you. The interest rate on 10-year Treasury bonds, last I looked, was about 4.5%. That was what it was in the late 90s when we had a budget surplus and the debt was coming down. So you're very hard pressed to say we're anywhere close to that now. Could we be there somewhere in the future? I suppose it's not impossible, but I guess my view is as long as we have a strong economy, people will be buying our debt. So I don't think we have to worry about that as long as we have a strong economy. If we don't have a strong economy, sure. But then my view is, well, why don't we focus on making sure we have a strong economy and worry less about the debt?
So to summarize what you're saying is you're essentially saying, number one, you don't see a ton of proof that tax cuts are actually necessarily a great thing for the economy. And then number two, when it comes to debt, it's not something that you don't care about, but it's something that you wouldn't be as concerned about as like Elon or even what a lot of people on the conservative side, they really want the debt to go away. Would you say that that's an accurate summary?
That's accurate. Let me throw in one other thing in the mix. I don't want to be totally off topic, but I do think it's important. We pay for things, most things, of course, with direct checks. So people getting their Social Security, we give them a check. We want a company to build a road, we pay them for it. We give them a check, electronic transfer. But we also pay for things another way. We give patent and copyright monopolies. Those are actually huge. These are really big obligations. I think there's very little appreciation of how much money is involved in government-granted patent and copyright monopolies. And I just mentioned that because this is a huge impact on the economy. The case of prescription drugs is an area I have looked at a fair bit. We'll spend $650 billion this year on prescription drugs and other pharmaceuticals. If we snapped our finger, no patents, probably spend about $100 billion. That difference, $550 billion, that's about $4,000 a family. That's really big money, even in the context of the U.S. economy or the federal government. So when people are getting really hyperventilating about, oh my God, the burden of the debt, look at all this, go, well, what about the burden of patent monopolies, copyright monopolies? That's a really, really big deal. No one ever even talks about it.
All right, let's start with taxes.
Yeah, taxes.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So I think it depends on what the tax cut is. And let's start with saying that, let's start with extension of the 2017 tax law is not a tax cut. It is from a deficit and budget and all that kind of stuff. But from the economy standpoint, it's not. It's a tax increase if it's not done.
No.
Because now you have less money in the economy rather than the existing money in the economy. So you are putting some brakes on. Now, I think the taxes act more as brakes than you do. Clearly, Dean, I think taxes are, but it depends on where they are. So, for example, you're right. You tax Elon Musk another 10%, no big deal. But you tax a small business owner, increase their tax rate by 10%, you're going to put brakes on for sure because they are much more susceptible. They're going to adjust their behavior a lot more because while they don't spend all their money, it has an impact on, okay, why am I doing all this? Because an entrepreneur takes an enormous amount of risk. They put in enormous hours, okay, way more than the average employee. And now, if you add a lot of taxes to them, which is what Bernie Sanders and et al. Wanted to do under the Build Back Better plan, what you do is you put significant brakes on the economy. Okay, so the current tax bill, just extending the 2017, that's not a tax decrease from an economic standpoint. It is from a budget deficit, but it's not from an economic standpoint. Second of all, I think it depends on where the tax cuts are, Caleb, as to what kind of impact they have from a growth standpoint. And I think it depends on, frankly, this whole discussion of do we make them temporary or permanent has a big impact. Because one of the, of all of the tax changes in 2017, the one that was permanent was the corporate tax rate. And then, but the problem is that immediately after that tax cut was made, the Democrats started talking about raising the corporate tax rate back up, which puts the brakes on because people perceive that, wait a minute, is it really going to be permanent? And so I think that what happens is you don't get the economic impact when you have one of the major parties saying, hey, we're going to reverse this as soon as we get in office, we're going to reverse this. And so I think that's actually an issue that I don't like the temporary nature. You have a much bigger impact. I'm a business owner, okay? That's what I do. I'm not, I run businesses for a living and I serve businesses for a living. And so we need stability. Okay, and this idea, I'll give you a perfect example. So the research and development expense, which is now capitalized, okay, it was made, that was supposed to be temporary. The idea was, well, we're not going to put it in, it's not going to happen until 2023, and it's going to be or 2022, it's going to be temporary because they're going to bring it back in. But I will tell you, I know business owners that paid an effective tax rate of 80%. because so much of their money goes into research and development. And I'm going to tell you, if you take that incentive away, if you take that away, you're going to reduce the research and development that's done. Okay, that's what's going to happen because they can't afford to do it. I mean, they might be able to afford to do it in the short term, but they can't afford to do it in the long term. So that's one I would love to see. Let's make it permanent. The bonus depreciation, being able to deduct capital expenditures. We're the only country that doesn't deduct capital expenditures. Most countries allow full deduction of capital expenditures. So why don't we do that? Our corporate tax rate, I would love to see a 15% corporate tax rate, frankly. And I'd love to see a deduction for dividends. I'd like to see the corporation get a deduction for dividends. And why? Because we're prioritizing debt over equity by giving a deduction for interest and not a deduction for dividends. And by the way, most countries only have a single tax. They give a deduction for dividends, right? Or you have a pass-through situation. But you rarely, in most countries, you don't have this double taxation like we have. A 15% tax rate, actually, that's an incentive that I think would help. It would bring people here. We have people, there's a reason companies locate in Ireland and Hong Kong. They have low tax rates. They're in the 12 to 15% rate. That's why people locate there. So I do think that you would bring companies here. And I think if we were at a higher corporate tax rate than 21%, if you add in our state taxes, we're the same as every other country. We're not lower than any country. We're the same as other countries. Okay. On top of that, we don't have a value-added tax. Okay. So, we're actually not taxing as much as other countries right now, but it would sure be nice if we were actually a place where people could come and say, hey, I want to be here. I want to be in the U.S. So I think it depends on the nature of the tax cut. There's investment or production tax cuts, which is what the corporate tax rate is. It's what the bonus depreciation or capital expenditure or research and development. Those are investment tax cuts. And then you have consumer tax cuts. Now, consumer tax cuts are a little like giving a child a piece of candy, right? I mean, they're really good as long as you have it and you get this immediate infusion. And I tend to agree with you, David. I think the consumer tax cuts, they're just not long lasting. They're just not because they're this feeling, oh, I have a little bit more money, maybe I'll spend a little bit more money, maybe I'll go out eat, a few times more, but it's not a long-lasting effect on the economy. So I tend to agree. So I think it depends on the type. Next question was the deficit, right?
The deficit and debt.
My restriction is I'm an accountant, so I actually think debits ought to equal credits.
Yeah.
Right. So I actually think you ought to balance I actually think we ought to be closer to a balanced budget. So Dean, I do think that I don't see the U.S. bond market failing anytime soon. I mean, the reality is that it's all relational, right, to other countries, right? Because it's how strong is the dollar vis-a-vis other countries. It's not how strong is the dollar vis-a-vis the dollar. It's how strong are we vis-a-vis other countries. And so as long as we're, this strong economy, we're going to continue, people are going to continue to want our debt, right? Because like you say, Dean, they're going to continue on our debt. I do now, though, want to address the patent and copyright because you're assuming that all that research and development still gets done and we have all those drugs, which we do not without patent and copyright law.
No, I'm not assuming that. I'll come back to that.
That goes away. So my point is that I think, part of what makes the U.S. different from every other country is that in our Constitution, we have a right to property. Okay? That is in the Constitution, a right to property. And patent and copyright law is actually essential to that right. And so granted, it gives a temporary monopoly. Copyright law does not do much for anybody. I mean, it just means that you can't copy my song or my book verbatim. Okay, I've had lots of conversations with my IP attorney on this. On the other hand, patents are strong, but they're limited in the length of time. And so, you can have that question. You have that question all day long about how long should they be. But I do think that if you got rid of all the patents and you got rid of the copyrights, yeah, you get an immediate influx, but you'd also have very little.
The incentive for
The incentive to do that is much lower.
Dean, how would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, no, a lot of stuff raised there, and a lot of things I agree with. The corporate tax code's a mess, and what I would say, I've written about this. I found out I stole this idea from someone with some notoriety, Fred Bankman, that I would love to see us move from. I didn't know that at the time, by the way. I kept asking who came up with this. Basically, if you gave the government a non-voting stake in corporations, which you could do a variety of ways. And we could argue about the amount. You can make it 15%, you can make it 20%, you can make it 25%. That removes all these issues. So whatever the shareholders get, the government gets 15% of it, or 20%, or 25%. It's non-voting, so they're not running the companies. They're just they're just saying we're taking the stake. I'd love to see that. Get rid of a lot of tax accountants, maybe some of your friends, but it would make it enormously simple. So I'd love to see that. In terms of things being permanent, of course, but the world changes. So we're just seeing this with, President Biden was trying to promote clean energy. Trump says, "Oh no, we're not. We're cutting off everything. We're not even going to let you. We're not even going to let you put up clean energy installations on public property. We're banning it." So it's not just that we're promoting oil and gas. Argue about that, but it's just saying no, we don't. We're going to. So maybe you like that policy, but again, the point is policies change. So tax policies change, other policies change. We might all like to have it frozen, but that's not the world. Now, patent and copyright, of course, I understand the incentive. And, it's worth looking at the Constitution because the mention of patent and copyright is it's not in the Bill of Rights. It's in a power of Congress. So it's alongside the power to tax, the power to declare war. It's not an individual right. It's a way to promote innovation, promote creative work. So it is that. The question is, can you have other ways of doing that? And that's what I've argued for. So currently, we spend $50 billion a year on biomedical research, the National Institutes of Health, or at least we did until 2 weeks ago, through the National Institutes of Health and other government agencies. You'd have to increase that, probably triple that, to replace what the industry does. But if you did that, everything would be in the public domain from day one. So as soon as we had a new blockbuster drug, a great treatment for cancer or diabetes, it's available as a cheap generic from the first day. So I think that's a much, much better way. We also get rid of the perverse incentives created by patent monopolies. And, to take the most extreme example, the opioid epidemic. You had drug companies, they knew that their product was addictive, but they told doctors, no, it's not. Well, why did they do that? If it was selling for a cheap generic, they're not, it's not that everyone's suddenly going to be honest, but, you're not going to push big lies like that to make a few bucks. When you can make $100, $200, $300 a prescription, yeah, you will, and you do. So I think that's a much, much better way. So the point is, we need incentives. No argument about that. But I'd argue that the current system of patent monopolies is a really bad way, particularly with prescription drugs. I'd look at different areas, differently. But in the case of prescription drugs, I think it's a horrible way to provide the incentive.
A quick response until I'll okay.
No, I will let you move on.
All right. To you, what's your view on the wealth tax, unrealized capital gains tax? What's your thoughts?
Well, first of all, A, it's unconstitutional, in my opinion. Okay. B, it's unworkable. Okay. France proved that. Other countries have proved it's unworkable. And C, I get the idea of wanting to tax the rich. I get that. And we do have this enormous, and if we're not careful, we're going to have a massive revolution, because every revolution starts because of the big disparity between the super rich and the average person. That's what every revolution in history has started that way. Okay, so we do need to deal with that. But I'd be happier with something like Hillary Clinton proposed when she was running for president against Trump. She proposed a surtax at a certain level. I have no issue with that. Okay, put a surtax, but keep it in the income tax. Do we need another tax? This is the problem. You add a tax. Let's go back to the original
1930s,
U.S. income tax. It was a very small tax on a very small percentage of the income of a very small percentage of people. Okay, and now what is it? Now it's like flipped. Originally, employees weren't taxed at all. You weren't taxed on your wages. Okay, that didn't happen until 1944. So so what happens is, this is the problem with government, is that it can't possibly, there isn't a dollar it doesn't want to spend as a general rule. And I'm not talking about Republicans and Democrats. I'm talking about government in general. That is the nature of the government beast. And so adding another tax, to me, why are you adding another tax? Like, Trump's talking about taking away the income tax. Well, unless you actually take away the 16th Amendment, you're not really taking away the income tax. You're just taking away the current tax rate in the income tax. And now you're adding another tax. Tariffs are another tax, or, national sales tax is another tax. I just don't like adding additional taxes, because I just think they're too easy for politicians to use. I mean, the greatest power that a politician has is the power to tax. That's their greatest power. And so, they don't like giving it up, but they love getting more of it. And so that's, the wealth tax, besides being, I think, very unworkable, I think it's a very difficult tax. I don't like the idea of it. I think it's completely unconstitutional. I just don't like having it. I just don't like the idea of adding another tax. Just do a surtax on those people.
I think I'd largely agree with you, perhaps for somewhat different reasons. But, the wealth tax first got a lot of notoriety about a decade ago. Thomas Piketty, in his book, said, okay, we need a wealth tax to deal with inequality. A lot of people said, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's have a wealth tax. And, I think first and foremost, it just would be very, very hard to implement practically, because it's so easy for, the people you're trying to target. They have their wealth in the Bahamas, in France, and they have this idea, oh, we're going to track that all down. And go, I don't bet on that, So, I mean, to my view, there's nothing worse than having a tax that you can't collect. I remember years ago, you might have known Bill Niskanen, who was president of the Cato Institute for a number of years. And I disagreed with him on a lot of things, but I always thought he was an honest guy, straight dealer. And, I'd debate him, and I'd always be, yeah, you're all wrong, Bill. You're all wrong, Bill. And anyhow, so we were talking about, going back to the Eisenhower years, 90% tax. And he did some calculations, if you throw in sales tax, it's over 100% tax. I don't remember the exact calculations were. And I shot back and I go, no one was paying that. And then Bill turns to me and he goes, well, if you have tax that no one's paying, it's probably not a very good tax. And had to say, you got a point. So, if we're going to push for a tax, a wealth tax, we want to make sure we know how to collect it. And I really don't think we do, barring a lot of other changes that we're not about to see. And the legal issues, it doesn't matter whether I think it's constitutional. We have a Supreme Court there. Yep. I don't think they're going to think it's constitutional. So I can't imagine something worse than making a big effort, push it through Congress, get the president to sign it, and then get the Supreme Court go no deal. So I'm inclined to agree with you on that. I'm agnostic on the taxing on unrealized capital gains. I understand your point there, and it is like a wealth tax. How would the court see that? Probably like a wealth tax. It has the advantage that you don't give people an incentive just to avoid capital gains tax by holding forever. That's an advantage. But anyhow, we can argue about that. But I agree with you. The best way to go is, whether Clinton's formula is perfect, but just raise the tax rate, on, if you want to call it a surtax, however you want to put it, but you could have a higher tax rate on high income people, and everything's already in place. You just change the number from, I guess we're at 35 currently, so we could argue, do you want 38, do you want 45? We could argue.
What do you think the tax should be? Because I won't make any assumptions, but do you think the taxes do need to be raised? And
I certainly for high-end people,
What tax rate do you think it should be raised?
I wouldn't put it much over 45. I think that would be a high ballpark. The reason why I say that is because we have state and local taxes. So in California, a high-end person is paying a 13% tax, and it's no longer deductible against your federal tax. So you're at 58. So if you made 45, and it's not. Again, it's getting okay. How high can we make it and still collect it? So I think 45 is ballpark number.
Your thoughts on Art Laffer's curve? You don't agree with his philosophy there?
Well, there's some extreme cases, going back to my argument with Bill Niskanen, 90%, we weren't getting that. So if we made it 80%, will we get more? Probably. If we made it 70%, we want to know where that number is. Clearly, there's some point where you aren't getting the money, and you don't want to be above that point. And again, we have to look carefully where that point is.
When Art Laffer, who I like a lot personally as well as economically, but where he was starting when he came up with the Laffer curve. We had a much higher tax rate, right? Much higher tax rate. And so you were going to get bigger. Well, to your point, I actually think I'm okay with 45% as long as it's a surtax and you're not, again, the question really is who's rich, right? Because if you're not about the ultra wealthy, you're talking about people make $100 million a year or even $10 million a year. Those are ultra wealthy people. But you talking about an entrepreneur who's making $1 million a year, I'm sorry, that's not ultra wealthy anymore. It's not. I mean, they're not able to do the things that, they don't have 5 houses, right? They don't have all this luxury stuff. I mean, to me, we've got to change our thought process. $400,000 is not rich. I'm sorry, it's just not rich in this country. And so when I think of a surtax, I'm going, if you had a 5% surtax or an 8% surtax, you're talking about 8% at this point, an 8% surtax on people making $10 million a year, I don't think it even phases them because that's just extra money, and I don't think it hurts the economy either. But if you put that on people who are reinvesting the money back into their businesses, back into the economy, now all of a sudden, 40% historically is that magic number where, I mean, there's a reason that even Biden wasn't going to get over 40%. And the reason is because it seems to be a magic number for, do people start working less at 40%? It seems to be. Okay, and I don't know all the numbers, and I haven't done all the data work on that. And you may have done that, Dean, but I haven't. But I do think that once you get much over that, you've got a problem. And capital gains, we know that if you get over 28%, really 25 to 28%, then all of a sudden you actually start losing money if your capital gains rate gets over that. So you got to be careful with how the money actually works on how high you get and who it is that you're taxing.
I just want to make one point that I'm sure we agree on, that it's just important for people to know these are marginal taxes. I used to teach economics many years ago, and I'd always tell students, I'd have a question on the exam. I tell them I'm gonna have a question on the exam. You can't end up with less money by earning more and being in a higher bracket, and they would still get it wrong. I tell them it's gonna be on the exam.
Literally, Dean. So I used to teach this class every month to investors, people who wanted to start investing. And I'd actually ask them, we'd actually go through an example of a $5,000 bonus when they were just on that cusp of getting the next bracket. And you would not believe what percentage of the class, and these are smart people, they paid a lot of money to get into this class, who think that you actually lost money by getting a $5,000 raise. I'm going, no, it does not work that way.
Yeah,
I love it. All right, we're probably at our last question because I want to be cognizant of time. This is a 2-part question, and we'll start with you, Dean. Number one, I would love for you to say, what do you like about Trump's proposal? Is there anything that you like what Trump's opened up his mouth and talked about or doing? That's number one. And if you had a magic wand, this is part 2 in the question. If you had a magic wand and you could do any tax/economic policy and have Trump and have Congress pass it, what would that be? I'm going to ask the same question to you, but I'm going to ask you to be critical of if there's one thing that you would be critical of. So,
well, the one thing that he did in his first term, I haven't heard him say this again. He's kind of gone the other way, but his tax cut in 2017 was supposed to be about eliminating, reducing deductions and lowering rates. And I was actually sympathetic to that in both the corporate and individual case. In the individual case, we raised the standard deduction, so a lot more people, like 90%, are now, which I think is great. You don't have to play around. It's very simple. That's a really great thing. And with the corporate, again, I don't think they did eliminate many deductions, but that was, so I think that was something that he did that I liked. In terms of policies, I raised this before. This will seem off the wall to people perhaps, but again, switching from supporting financing drug development with patent monopolies to direct research, everything open source, everything is fully available as a generic from the day it's approved by the FDA. I would love to see that. I think it would make such a difference, not just in the economy, but in people's lives. I mean, think of this. You have people that have cancer, they need a drug, and the doctor tells them, this probably could help you, but it's going to cost $80,000 a year. They call their insurer, well, we don't know, this and that. They don't have that much money. They do go, that's just crazy. Because again, the research has already been done. that's why it's crazy. I mean, if it actually were the case, we have to get all these highly trained people, and then you understand it. At least that's the issue. But in this case, that's not the issue. The research is already done. So if we could change that, I just think it would make so much difference in so many people's lives, and it would be good for the economy.
Yeah, so my biggest complaint about what Trump's proposed is the giveaways to certain groups, not taxing tips, increasing the state and local tax deduction, which should be zero. There is no possible justification for giving a state and local tax deduction. The states don't give a federal tax deduction. Why does the federal government give a state tax deduction? The idea of we're not going to tax overtime. The one thing actually I would like to see is I don't like the idea of taxing Social Security. I don't care who it is. I just don't like the idea of taxing Social Security. You already paid that tax. I mean, you're taxing it again. And I'm going, wait a minute, I didn't get a deduction for my Social Security in the first place, so why am I paying tax on it when I get the Social Security? I don't understand that. So I'm not a big fan of taxing Social Security, but I do understand that it's actually a very heavy lift because it actually goes into the Social Security fund, which is really, I mean, Social Security is a Ponzi scheme, right? So you've got to have it keep going, and we've got a reduced birth rate. The Ponzi scheme falls apart when you have a reduced birth rate. So you actually have to deal with that. I think if I waved that magic wand, I'd eliminate the 16th Amendment and I'd put in some kind of a national sales tax or value-added tax. That's what I would do, particularly value-added. And the reason I like the value-added is because of the international implications of that. Everybody else has value-added tax across the world. There's value-added tax, and we have some state and local sales taxes, et cetera, but it's not very coherent whatsoever. And but you'd have to get rid of the 16th Amendment to do that, because would never want to put in a value-added tax when we had an income tax, even if the income tax rate were zero.
Yeah, because you could.
Because someday, look what happened with Reagan. I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. during the Reagan years, okay? He brought the tax rates down, way down. So then what happened? And he broadened the base. So then what happens? Well, now we got the bridge by and we just ratchet up the tax rates, right? So I would argue that a 37% tax rate now is way more than a 90% tax rate was under Eisenhower. It's way more. It collects way more money. It's a way higher tax because it's so easy to get out of that. Like you said, Dean, it's so easy to get out of that 90% tax rate. Nobody's paying it. I mean, you had all these you did have a lot of loopholes. I mean, prior to Reagan, you had an enormous number of loopholes. And so I'd like to have, perfect world, we really would not have an income tax because you're taxing people's production.
Yeah.
Right, and I don't like the idea of taxing people's production. I'm a much bigger fan of tax their consumption, not their production.
Dean, I know you have a hard stop. You can address that, and then do you believe inflation and the economy is going to be greater these next 40 years, or do you think we're in for a harsh awakening with the tariffs and what Trump has proposed?
Yeah, well, I think I've already expressed my preference for the income tax as being progressive, and I don't think we could replicate that with sales tax. But I worry very much we'll see higher inflation. I mean, the prospect of tariffs is virtually, it's almost guaranteed. It's, you're raising the cost of all these imports, and then, of course, the domestic goods that compete with them. And then on top of that, the prospect of large-scale deportations. You have industries that are very heavily dependent on undocumented workers, starting with the farm sector, but also food processing, construction. You'll see a lot higher prices there. I don't know if that means we're going to get double-digit inflation. Hopefully not. But, can inflation go up 2, 3, 4 percentage points? Certainly. I'm very worried about that.
Any final words?
No, I would agree with that. It's not going to, it's not a direct relationship. So if there's a 10% tariff, that doesn't mean your price is going to increase 10%, but it does mean it's going to increase something. Okay. And I think you're right, Dean. I think, you're going to get that 3-4% inflation by defining inflation as higher prices, not the traditional too much money chasing too few goods, which is the traditional definition of inflation. But if you're still talking about higher prices, yeah, for sure. And Trump promised to disrupt, and he is delivering on that promise.
I think we can all agree on that. Yeah. I think you can all agree on that. Dean, thank you.
Thank you, Dean.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot. Good seeing you, Tom, Kayla.
Nice to meet you, Dean.
I enjoyed it.